class later. Hey buds, Socialism Done Left here for the review of a video by Paul Cockshott on the limits of market socialism. Now, as a market socialist myself, who used to be a great fan of Paul Cockshott, and who I still, on several topics, appreciate Paul Cockshott, such as central planning, I thought that I would have reasonable level of knowledge to critique Paul Cockshott's critiques of market socialism. So with that, let's begin.
Okay, hi, this is Paul Cockshott here. I've been asked by Finball to give a talk. He left it open what topic to cover. Suggested either something on why bourgeois economics is wrong, or something on market socialism and why market socialism has limitations or reasons to be skeptical of it. And because I've put up lots of videos already on what's wrong with bourgeois economics, I decided what I'd do was the market socialism one, as I haven't produced much in the way of actual talks on market socialism. So the talk's called Limits of Market Socialism. And if you want to be following it on slides, I'm moving on to slide 2. And basically, the summary of my talk is that I'm going to be dealing with the role that the ideology of market socialism played in the collapse of hitherto existing socialism. Then I'm going to go on to a somewhat technical argument about its effect on wealth distribution, mention a bit about unemployment, and at the end, I'll finish on the limited positive role that markets have under socialism, in terms of consumer goods markets and in terms of transitional measures when shifting from a capitalist economy to a socialist economy or a communist economy.
So, having watched this video, I think that I reasonably strongly disagree with the first point, very strongly disagree with the second point. I think I disagree not about the facts, but about the morals of the third point. And then I generally agree, but more strongly with the fourth and fifth points for the utility of market socialism in managing consumer goods and as providing a transition between capitalism and socialism. Blind Speedruns asks, can you slow yourself down instead? I will try. I'm going to turn Cockshott up just a little bit.
Now, let's focus on the ideological role, because that is quite critical to follow what happened from the 1960s through to the late 1980s in the existing Soviet bloc, the socialist bloc. During the 1960s to the mid-80s in Eastern Europe, market socialism was initially presented as a reform of the existing socialist system. The claim was being made that the advocates of market socialism just wanted a better socialism. They wanted one that was more responsive to consumer demand, and also, if you take the case of the people from Yugoslavia, they wanted one which would give more autonomy to workers at individual factories. Now, that was how it was presented initially.
As far as I'm aware, that's pretty historically accurate.
Now, when you look at the concrete aims, or the concrete demands, there was a gradual escalation of them. One of the first objectives was to allow enterprises to return more of their turnover. And it was said that this would lead to greater efficiency because it would give incentives to factory managers to operate efficiently if the enterprise was able to hold more of its turnover. Now, obviously, behind that, there's a distributional issue. There's an issue of, is the state able to actually appropriate the product produced in its factories, or does the product to some extent become the private property, at least of the enterprise, and possibly of the managers in the enterprise? Another goal was to allow some flexibility in the setting of prices. And this argument for flexibility of the setting of prices has some credibility because often the administered prices were essentially, could be quite far removed from prices that are proportional to values. The law of value was not closely followed, in the sense that when I use the term law of value here, I mean they were not closely following the principle that the selling price of goods to consumers should be proportional to the labour time incorporated in them. They roughly followed this, but not as closely as might be the case. And in certain...
So one thing that I think is going to be a critique, that's where I and Cockshott diverge, is our foundations. Like I said, I used to like Paul Cockshott. One of the things that I quite liked is I liked his arguments about the LTV. I no longer like those arguments about the LTV. I think that those arguments are weak. And as I will explain in a debate that I'm having tomorrow with Victor Magano, I believe, I think that the arguments for the LTV ultimately fall apart. So I no longer believe that labor is the ultimate determinant of like the median prices in an economy, and therefore I do not believe that like diverging from it is a good or bad thing.
Critical goods or classes of goods, there was quite significant deviations of prices from values. And this could be presented as a failure to meet market needs or market demand. So that when talking about the law of value in the Soviet bloc, there was a confusion between, do you mean the accurate representation of embodied labour time, or by the law of value, do you mean just a shorthand way of saying determination of price by supply and demand?
So again, his argument here is explicitly that like it's bad to have things determined by supply and demand. It is good to have things determined by what he calls embodied labor time, which is fundamentally saying labor theory of value. So again, I think this is a fundamental thing. We don't need to debate about market socialism adhering to this. We need to debate about the fundamental thing first. So,
in a sense, some people talking of the law of value were using it as a way of incorporating basically neoclassical ideas about price. It was also argued that market socialism would allow the formation of worker co-ops. And this is a theme which you also get fairly widely in the West among anarchist currents or syndicalist currents. And if you look at the initial reforms by Gorbachev, he allowed the formation of workers' co-ops, but at that stage still said that the private employment of wage labour should be prohibited, i.e. it was still seen as something exploitative and something which shouldn't be permitted. So at this stage, it's still within the realms of socialism in that it is seeking to make sure that there is no income from exploitation, income from the exploitation of labour power. I'm now on to number 7.
So on the third one, I do think that one of the things, what you're talking about, the Paul Cockshott video about market socialism, yes. Live Speed Runs is talking about Bitcoin mining. I don't think that's relevant. Alien AI says, do you think that market socialism is a permanent thing or just as a transition? I think that both. I think that probably we're talking like 100, 200 years of market socialism as the ability of planning increases and increases. And I think that there is evidence that competition often boosts innovation. So even as we move towards central planning, generally the move there would be trying to find ways to make central planning improve the innovativeness of markets. So generally it would be finding ways to make competition and cooperation operate simultaneously, something along those lines. Which is something that we already do to some degree under current governments. As Matsukudo's 2011 The Entrepreneurial State argues, one of the big roles of the state is in coordinating production, coordinating innovation. So in the very long run, it might be technologically and administratively feasible to centrally plan things, but I have less faith in that than I used to because of the importance of innovation, because innovation is the ultimate long-term driver of growth.
I'm now on to number 7. The effects of this, though, once it started to be put in, were to rehabilitate liberal economics, rehabilitate ideas from Western economic studies. And it created general license to criticise and rubbish socialist ideology. And you also got, in the USSR certainly,
So I think this is like a weak criticism. Like the systems we're talking about, the USSR, the Eastern Bloc, Yugoslavia, were relatively undemocratic systems with a high degree of control over what was publishable. If the argument is just like, hey, at the same time that these market reforms were being proposed, we also saw an opening up of these journals and people were more free to criticize socialism. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. This seems like a very weak argument. Now you could argue that maybe this was influential in helping move people to being accepting the downfall of socialism, sure, but I think that was coming as you open up the press in general. There's a reason why the surviving one state party regime of China and to some degree Vietnam and again to some degree Cuba have very slowly, if at all, opened up their markets. Have opened up their media. It is basically media control was very essential to maintaining this sort of structure. So to me, the fact that these systems are so authoritarian and they fail to do so is a blow against them, not an argument in favor of them.
The growth of a plethora of small businesses who were exploiting what were nominally co-ops in order to set up what were really capitalist businesses, and that they were co-ops in name only. And this established a new private bourgeois class, a class of private business managers. The effect of
one of the things I want to talk about here is it seems very unlikely that within, you're talking 5 to 10 years, that any person could accumulate enough wealth to one of the nice definitions of the distinction between bourgeois and non-bourgeois that I quite like is a business person, a bourgeois, a capitalist. is someone who owns enough capital that they don't need to labor. Fundamentally, if they choose to labor, it's because that labor is valuable to them or they enjoy labor, but they own enough capital that the capital gains from that will provide them a sufficient income to labor. I don't know that that was the case in like the USSR or Yugoslavia. If what he's talking about here are simply like wealthy individuals who own small businesses, I don't think that's a very strong argument that was like a key driver in bringing back capitalism. To some degree, any cooperative, most cooperatives shouldn't have small business people at the top. It should be like a sharing of wealth. So like that's a failure if so. But like the fact that some people might have more wealth in a cooperative is not itself like a very strong argument that this is going to like bring back capitalism, unless that wealth keeps accumulating to the degree where it can like encourage people to have systematically different interests, which I don't think that Cockshott's going to demonstrate in this video. Oh, and then he's going to talk about the tax effect of this.
The other demand.
I will look at chat. I will see what chat is saying. Basically, everyone who does FIRE means they're trying to be bourgeois. I don't know what you mean by FIRE. What about the people who accumulate lots of capital by laboring? So one of the things that's interesting is it's very hard. Like, let's say that you earned $500,000 per year and you worked for 60 years, you'd still only end up with around like $30 million. At that point, then you could be like a capitalist or something, but you'd also be so old that like this argument doesn't really apply. The key group of people that we're trying to think of are people who have inherited or accumulated a whole bunch of wealth very early on in their lives, and for a significant period of their life are using that wealth to like derive gains from other people. I do think that to some degree there's a problem with people who have very high incomes, but again, this isn't a problem with market socialism per se. This is a problem with distribution of income. I think that one of my solutions to a whole lot of what Cockshott's going to say is you should just redistribute income from the rich to the poor. Financial independence, retire early, basically not have enough passive income with index funds and stuff. So basically I would say that is like, basically, yes, that is like bourgeois. And I understand why people desire that. They want to do like a whole bunch of, they don't want to work. Nobody wants to work. The problem is that people seeking to do so are not doing so in a productive way. You should not be able to like invest. I shouldn't quite say that. It is useful to have good investors make good decisions because that drives money to the correct sectors of the economy. However, it is probably not a good thing to have people who have as their life goal are trying to do that. You should want people to be like providing those innovative skills to work, to provide additional innovation, to keep investing correctly. You don't actually want people to like retire early. You don't want people to have this ability to opt out of the economy. I don't know. All right, he's going to say that this hurt tax revenues, which is a really bad take.
For the retention of more turnover by state enterprises was to generate a shortage of state revenue. You have to realize that in the USSR, a substantial part of the total state revenue came from the profits that were being made by state factories, which were handed over to the government and could then be used to finance social services, finance defense, finance research and development, etc. So these had been a key part of state revenue. And if you just ceding to the demands of the pro-market sector of the managerial class, allow the local managers to have a larger share of that, obviously a smaller share goes to the state. And unless at the same time some alternative system of taxation had been introduced, the inevitable effect is you get a state budget deficit.
So this is one of those things. The de facto in the Soviet Union, you can think about it as either as a sales tax or a value-added tax. De facto, the only tax that USSR had was a hidden value-added tax or a hidden sales tax. The prices of goods were increased high enough that the additional money that went back to the government was used to pay for education and roads and other infrastructure things. This is a really bad way of taxing people. Like, regardless of like, basically the problem is that all of the taxes that they were imposing were regressive. So they hurt the poor more than they hurt the rich. If you want to be imposing like progressive taxes, you want to be doing stuff like wealth taxes. You want to be doing stuff like income taxes. And the reason they didn't was mostly because of ideological reasons. They wanted to say that there was no taxation in their system because they had achieved socialism. This is just like a silly argument. They should have just adopted an income tax. What Paul Cockshott is saying, market socialism caused the collapse of these countries because they didn't just adopt a better form of taxation. They should have done that from the fucking beginning. They shouldn't have had to wait until market socialism to do that. And then he's going to explain why their failure to do so caused big consequences. Where did the cat ears go? All right, if you're talking about this cat, it's still right there. If you're talking about on my head, that was for Friday. I'm maybe going to do Femboy Fridays.
and you had the printing of money to cover the government spending. You got rapid inflation. You got growing shortages. So all of these were direct economic effects during the Gorbachev period of putting into practice the demands of the market socialists.
One of the things that I consistently say when I'm talking to like people who support MMT or like people who like support really high inflation is virtually every socialist project, right? Social democracy around the world, the USSR, Venezuela, like any country you want to talk about that's adopting these like left-wing policies. What is the one thing that unites them in making them crash? It's fucking inflation. Okay, stop printing money. You can't just print money. So socialists, if there's one thing that I want to educate socialists on, is that money printer can go burr, but you have to have quite explicit limits on how much burr the money printer can go. Okay.
So we're on page 10 now, and particularly as a result of the inflation and shortages, you've got a growing social crisis and stormy class struggles taking place. And we know what happened in the end. It was the wreck of the state in the Soviet case. Now, we know it doesn't necessarily lead to the wreck of the state, because in the Yugoslav case, you had market socialist measures introduced 30 years earlier, or more than 30 years earlier, maybe 35 years earlier. And this didn't lead immediately to the wreck of the socialist state in Yugoslavia. The socialist state in Yugoslavia didn't actually collapse until after the Soviet bloc started to collapse. But in the Soviet case,
Yep. So exactly as I said, market socialism doesn't lead to collapses because you can have alternatives. Now, like alternative taxation methods, alternative ways to fund like your government. Now, Yugoslavia also did more or less exactly the same thing that the USSR did. The Yugoslavian market socialist model had a whole lot of failures, which, what's his name? Michael Romer, I think, who is a market socialist, critiques in his book on market socialism, which I won't get to too much in depth here. But in short, guess what Yugoslavia was doing? They took out like 20 IMF loans. They hugely boosted up their inflation to pay for state debts instead of reducing their spending. Again, socialists got to limit how much money printer go burr. That's my takeaway from a lot of this.
Page 11 now. The effect was the eventual drowning of socialism. There was you had a rapid shift to a capitalist economy, mass mortality in the working class, particularly among males and particularly among manual workers. You had unemployment, you had hunger, you had around 12 million excess deaths in the 20 years which followed the transition to capitalism.
The shock transition to capitalism was like an unabated failure in most countries. It should have been slower. Like the rapid shift to capitalism caused like a huge economic crisis. It could have been done much more slowly, could have had so much less deaths. Even if we wanted to get to capitalism, if that were the solution. I think it is very hard to look back in history and support the shock transition from virtually any perspective. Zusu says, money printer manufacturer go burr. Brian says, I don't think MMTers advocate for nonstop money printing. And I agree. The only reason that I bring it up as a concern is that I think that normalizing money printing as a solution to your problems could lead some politicians who might not be as scrupulous as you to just print money.
About 12 million excess deaths in Russia alone. That's not counting the excess deaths in the Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, etc. Now, why did all this happen? Let's for a moment ignore the political overdetermination. The fact that the demands for market socialism in the USSR were overdetermined by a struggle between Marxism and Western economic ideology, and overdetermined by class contradictions between the working class and the intelligentsia. Let's put that aside and assume you start off with something which is not of that character, something more like what happened in Yugoslavia. We have to say, why is market socialism an unstable mix? Why is it likely to get blown onto the rocks? I'm on number 14 now. If you look at what Lenin was saying in the early stages of the NEP, he's making concessions towards the market at that point. But he also says that the market economy constantly at 1,000 places gives rise to capitalist relations. And he knew this from his very early work, the development of capitalism in Russia. His work on the transition to capitalism in the Russian countryside, which was his first major theoretical work. And he knew it on sociological grounds, that you got where you had market relations penetrating into the countryside, you had a differentiation of the peasantry into those who were richer and could employ labour, and those who were poorer and had to work for others, and you got the gradual formation.
That's exactly the class division that I was trying to point to before. The argument is capitalists are those who choose not to labor or don't have to labor, and the rest of us are those who have to labor.
of capitalist relations in the countryside, and which, in the development of capitalism in Russia, he was basically saying this is irreversible.
So one of the things that I think is coming up from this is that oftentimes when people who oppose market socialism talk about capitalist relations, they're really talking about market relations. And I think that generally it's this idea that if you have exchange for profit, if you exchange things based on exchange value, to use Marxist terms, rather than the labor theory value, that you are doing capitalism. And I think this is a very poor critique of the system, because capitalist relations, to me, are fundamentally based on class. It's based on the ability of one group to exploit you, to force you to labor, even though they themselves don't labor. I think that we're all people to be forced to labor, forced to participate in this market economy. That distinction, those class relations, significantly or seriously decrease. You can also have like a more equal market economy. That's about it. Blind Speedrun says, if the politicians keep printing money, then we just do a non-violent revolution. I don't know what that means, but please don't keep printing money.
Now, we now know that there are deep statistical reasons for this. And we know it because of another Russian, Viktor Yakovenko, who in the 90s, I think it was, wrote a very important article, The Statistical Mechanics of Money. And he was able to show that what Lenin had just observed as an empirical fact is a necessary consequence of monetary economic relations.
It's not. Hint.
He's a theoretical physicist, or solid-state physicist. And Yakovenko he's a physicist, but being a Russian who did his university education during the Soviet period, the only economics he'd learned was Marx's Capital. Now, he found that there was a deep correspondence between commodity traders or owners of commodities and molecules in a gas, and there's a deep correspondence between the money held by commodity traders and the energy of molecules in a gas. Now, in a certain sense, you can immediately see that there is a relationship, at least, in that market economies are chaotic, disorganized systems. They're also systems with very large numbers of agents, individuals and firms. So they must have bulk statistics, bulk statistical properties. The question is, what are the laws which govern this?
To be clear, I don't disagree with anything that he said so far. To some degree, you can consider markets as fundamentally like a huge agglomeration of individuals. When you agglomerate those behaviors, you get like market behaviors. That's like the foundation of what's called like, I guess you could call it like the new neoclassical synthesis sort of thing. Like you start from a solid micro, you aggregate those things up, and then you get like a big overall result. And this is something that virtually every economic theory, from Marx to Keynes and so on, will say that they acknowledge, and it just depends on how much they actually do so. So I don't actually disagree with this. Good theory.
Now, in a gas, you've got molecules buzzing around, and they keep bumping into one another. And when they collide, there's an exchange of energy between the molecules. But this exchange is governed by conservation laws. But at a similar level, whenever a commodity transaction takes place, someone buys something for money, whether it's an employer buying labour power, or you buying something in the shop, or one firm selling something to another, if you just consider the money and ignore the commodity that moves, just consider the circulation of money, these are random interactions in which money is exchanged, or money is transferred rather. Just as in molecular collisions, you have random interactions in which energy is transferred. But in both cases there's a conservation law. The quantity of energy or the quantity of money is conserved. And this imposes on both of them the same sort of aggregate statistics. Now, can I suggest you all go to slide 20, because if you can...
In case you aren't aware, he was doing this... Sorry, excuse me. In case you aren't aware, he was doing this in front of the Finball server as like a lecture, so that's why he's telling people to follow along. This guy has a terrible mic. Yes, like I said, unfortunately, Paul Cockshott just doesn't have great audio engineering. MC2806, but doesn't energy tend to dissipate, which is the opposite of money? I believe that's precisely the argument that he's going to raise, that in entropy, you tend to get an equal distribution of energy, and in money, you get like the opposite, highly concentrated money. Oh, I thought he was just a huge nerd that does videos with slide. He is also a huge nerd, I think PhD in like computer science, who does stuff with slides, but he was also just doing it because he was doing it in front of a live audience in a Finnish Bolshevik server, so like a ML server.
There is a video which you should be able to watch there. If you click on that slide, there is a start icon for the start of a video. If you click on it, you will see an animation of what happens to 500,000 agents, each of whom start off with the same amount of money. As it evolves, you see that a direct distribution, sorry, I'll go right back to the start. Go back to here. A direct distribution is one where everyone is the same. And that rapidly develops towards a Gaussian or normal distribution of money, that's fair enough. And the normal distribution spreads out until the left-hand side of it reaches zero. And that's people with no money at all. And as you observe it over time, you see the number of people with no money at all grows. And on the other side, you get a few people with a lot of money. The longer you run it, just a simulation, what's going on behind the scenes in generating this was a simulation of 500,000 agents interacting, each making small transactions between one another. And as it runs on, we'll move on to slide 21. You end up with a distribution of money among the agents which very closely fits the red line. And the red line is what's known as the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, which is the law which governs energy in a gas, on the molecules of a gas. So it shows from simulation that you would
Maybe I was wrong about the whole entropy thing. My bad.
expect money held by agents to follow the same law as energy of molecules in a gas. You get lots of people with almost no money and a small number of people with a lot of money. And this is just due to the random interaction that is taking place. And in both in the gas and in an economy, this is the result of the law of increasing entropy. If you look at the bottom side of the animation, you can see the entropy of the distribution, and it rises towards a plateau and stabilizes at a maximal entropy state. And the maximum entropy state is the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. In his original paper, he has slides which I reproduce here on sheet 22.
So just to be clear, what we're talking about here is Cockshott's argument is that just by the laws of like trading, there will naturally emerge a highly unequal distribution of income. And he's backing this up first with like a theoretical argument relating to like physics and a simulation that he runs based on certain models. Then he's going to back it up with empirical data.
What the actual empirical distribution of money holdings in the United States are. And they fit almost exactly to this Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. So he starts off from a purely theoretical argument about the nature of conservation laws and chaotic systems, predicts a distribution, observes that's what actually happens in a real capitalist economy. So why is this relevant for market socialism? Suppose you start with a set of co-ops.
So one of the things to be clear is he said this is what occurs in an actual capitalist economy. One of the things that I'm going to argue in just a moment is that this does not necessarily occur in a market socialist economy.
In a real capitalist economy.
Yep.
So why is this relevant for market socialism? Suppose you start with a set of co-ops and individual producers, and they're all equal at the beginning. The law of increasing entropy means that over time, the money that these co-ops or individual artisans will have will end up highly uneven. Even if it started off even, it'll become uneven as a result of random processes. A few co-ops will end up with a lot of money, and many will have very little. Many will be effectively bankrupt in these terms.
So one thing to be clear, that one of the basic problems that we're having here is this idea that let me let him finish. I apologize.
This means you get the creation of a reserve army of labour. A market economy, including one made of co-ops, has no guarantee that it'll operate at full employment. This was theoretically demonstrated by Kleski and Keynes in the 30s, obviously assumed by Marx, but people talking about market socialism tend to overlook this. They just assume there'll be full employment. There won't. And when you couple the existence of a reserve army of labour with the differentiation of co-ops, what's going to happen? Some people are going to migrate. Yugoslavia had a chronic labour migration problem of people migrating to Germany, which the Titoist government was willing to put up with because it reduced the level of visible unemployment in Yugoslavia.
So, to get, I guess, at his argument, before we get too far away from it. So, the argument is, in short, from a theoretical level, right, that, hey, if we just have random traders, some people will end up with a lot of money and some people will end up with no money. Now, I want to be clear, one thing that this distribution doesn't deal with is the fact that some cooperatives will be more productive than other cooperatives. In a well-functioning market system, you should expect more functioning cooperatives, better functioning cooperatives, to end up with more money. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Presumably, we want more money, we want more resources to be given to either like the individuals, the organizations that are better dealing with those increased funds. Probably that results in increased productivity for the entirety of the society. So some degree of inequality is desirable in that consequence. This is something that should be acknowledged even under like socialism, right? Sorry, not under socialism, even under central planning. unless your central planning is just like, ah, yes, I've got two iron firms, right, two iron like founders or something, and I'm going to provide each of them exactly the same amount of money, then you would have to acknowledge like, hey, one of these iron foundries is enormously more productive than the other one. Perhaps we should give that iron foundry the resources to expand more of that. Perhaps we should give the managers within that firm more resources. I think that not including productivity basically allows you to like argue that any distribution that is unequal is undeserved, and that's just not valid because we know that there are substantial productivity differences in real economies. I think that there was this one paper that I could cite in the concrete production market, which is not a market with very innovative technology or anything, that the most productive firms are literally 2 times more productive than the least productive firms. So there's this like very large distribution of productivity. The second problem with this argument is that when he's talking about a whole lot of people with almost no money, right? He like shows this graph, for example, that a lot of people have almost no individual income. What they're talking about here is the market income. Now, there's a difference between market income and like final income. So one of the roles of a like socialist state should be to reduce like wealth at the top and increase wealth at the bottom, because one of the things that we do know is that some of this distribution is just due to random chance. It is just due to unfairness. Some people just get lucky and do better in the economy, and some people just get unlucky and do worse in the economy. But one of the big differences between, like, say, socialism, like a market socialism, and a capitalism is the elimination of inheritance, for example. And basically what that does is it sets a limit at how much any individual can accumulate either in the positive or negative direction, especially combined with the welfare state. So, for example, let's say that we've imagined a society, like a socialist society, where you're just straight up capped at $100,000 per year. So the most that you could earn, let's say you start at age 20 and you work until age 80, the most that you could earn would be 100 times 60 is $6 million, right? That's a decent amount of money, but it's not that much money. And moreover, since there's no inheritance, the next person after you can't like just take it all away. Can't start with all of that money. There is a lack of compounding, because what happens is the next person down the line doesn't start with $6 million. They also start with the baseline wealth of society. So they too would have to earn their way up to $6 million.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
So de facto, you can limit the inequality of this distribution. You're limiting it over time because you're limiting basically the life length of those agents. Another thing that model doesn't include is that the agents there are immortal. The agents here are mortal. They die. And if you eliminate inheritance, and if you have like strong redistribution, especially towards the bottom, you can limit the amount of inequality. Again, some inequality is probably like merited, I guess is the way to think about it. The only argument that no inequality is worthwhile only works if you don't want to like encourage, how do I put this? I think that some of Paul Cockshott's arguments implicitly imply that meritocracy is not worthwhile, that encouraging productivity is not worthwhile. And there's just a lot of evidence, both from competition in markets and from, the example I would point to is performance pay for teachers. We know that increasing pay as people do better improves their performance. I think the estimate is that in performance pay systems, the average performance pay system, which gives teachers more money when their kids do relatively better than like at year start, for example, doing performance pay is equivalent to adding about 1 month of education each year, which is a lot. Like 1 month of education per year is a lot of education. Accumulated over 12 years, you're talking about an additional year of education. And I might note, for no additional cost. It's simply about distribution of income and not about amount of income. So I think that just demonstrating that inequality exists is not sufficient an argument against market socialism, unless you want to argue for an extreme vision of equality where there should be no distribution of income, where there should be no like payment based on productivity. And I just don't think I value equality in so much as because I think that highly equal societies provide everyone the ability to get ahead. I think that you need like an extreme equality of opportunity. Everyone needs to be provided all the resources they need to have a shot at whatever career goal they want to pursue, at whatever career goal is like useful for society. I do not, however, believe that you should like the whole equality of outcome sort of meme, that like you should want everyone to end up with the same income, even if it hurts society, even if you're reducing productivity. Because when you reduce productivity, you're actually hurting everyone in the long run. that's basically the take. Productivity is ultimately what's going to drive innovation. Productivity is ultimately what's going to drive efficiency gains, and those are what's going to drive long-term growth. So if your economy is growing at 2% instead of 3%, that means that 100 years down the line, the economy that's growing at 3% is going to be like twice as large as yours. Long-term growth really, really matters. Productivity really, really matters. I don't just like equality because equality good or something. That's my spiel. I know that was a relatively long one. So reading chat. Let's see. Oh, yes. So urban density says you want to preserve ordinality of incentives. Yes. Absolutely. I think that one of the points here is that you don't necessarily need large wage differentials to have like incentives to do better work. You just need like some degree of incentives. So you don't necessarily need something like the United States where the CEOs are paid like 127 times or 250 times as much as the worker to get them to like work harder. All you need is that within a profession, your labor is correlated with your productivity. And then urbane density also says, I agree that hostility to markets is an issue, but is class really the right thing to pivot to? I would say property/ownership is more precise. Fair enough. When I'm talking about class, how do I put this? When you're talking about capital ownership, Pinkwug says, even if you work 10 million times harder, I'm only going to pay you an extra $10,000. Okay, those are in the big socialist rule book that Karl Marx wrote. Basically, when I'm talking about class, how do I put this? When Marx talks about class, like the old-timey capitalists, they're like one dude owning a factory. But that's just not how class works anymore. The vast majority of people who own wealth are what Marx calls money capitalists, people who don't own factories, but who own stock in factories. The vast majority of like operations in most firms today are determined by managers who don't actually own those firms. Most CEOs don't own their firms. Bill Gates is rich not because he runs Microsoft. He's not a capitalist because he runs Microsoft. He's only got 1% of the shares in Microsoft. He's rich because he's got a huge amount of shares. Yeah, no. Okoyat says most entrepreneurs don't make millions and yet they still keep working. Yes, and this is precisely the point. You can have small wage differentials that still provide enough of an incentive to get these productivity bonuses. You don't need to pay the best paid teachers $1 million to have productivity different like essentials. It could just be something like, I don't know, a 1.5 times increase. And then we're talking about very small distributions of income. Rather than the kind that we have today, right, where the top 1% earns like 20, 30 times as much as the bottom 10%. You're talking about like a 2 to 3 to 5 times distribution of income. Basically, I've come at this from a lot of arguments. Fundamentally, I think it's about preserving productivity and preserving equality. There's some sweet spot where you maximize the benefits from equality because everyone has access to opportunity, and some sweet spot where there's just enough inequality related to productivity that people work really, really hard to like innovate and so on. On the class and ownership thing. So my argument is that most people who are wealthy today don't directly own firms. So merely, even if you have small firm businesses in like a market socialist thing, this isn't necessarily enough to like recreate capitalism on large. So long as no one is able to accumulate huge amounts of money to recreate these sort of like mass property differences, I think it's hard to argue that the incentive differences are really different. Because I think the way that I think about these things behind Marx, like what is Marx really getting at, is the bourgeois and the workers have fundamentally opposite incentives. The bourgeois want to get workers to work for as little as possible, and the workers want to work for as much as possible in terms of pay. And so this puts them at like direct opposite ends. The workers want a union to fight for like their ability to get more wages. The capitalists want to crush unions because they want to drive those wages down. And so if you're talking about like small business owners who might have like 2 times your income, but who are bound by very strict labor laws, who exist in a society where there's like universal unions, and basically their class incentives are different, but they're not so enormously different that they're going to diverge from you. I do think that fundamentally a social system can't allow private, like small business owners. But I'm just saying, like, even where we talk about like social democracy that's on the border of socialism, the difference between the capitalist and the worker, it gets increasingly small as you like mitigate these differences. The way that I think about these things, an additional way of thinking about these things is that these are on a gradient. the incentives of Jeff Bezos are so different to yours. Your incentives are work hard so that you get paid more. Your incentives are work and organize so that you get paid more. Jeff Bezos' incentives are get the workers to work less as much as possible. And as you move down wealth from Jeff Bezos, or as you move up wealth from like the worker, there's some point at which your incentives start to be more about reducing workers' pay than it is about like working hard. And you want to like ensure that everyone in society is below that point. Fundamentally, that is like the class conflict point, and your goal is that everyone is to the left of that point, as it were. It's obviously not like a point, it's like a range, but the point stands. You're saying that the point of democracy is to align interests. I'm saying the goal of socialism is to align interests. And I'm not saying this to be clear, that the fascists have their own turn on this actually. So I think this is an interesting thing. Fascists will say that class collaboration is the point. We should align everyone's interests, the capitalists and the workers, we should all align them to work for the interests of the nation, because the nation is the most important interest. I'm explicitly talking about these things in terms of class. I'm saying that the abolishment of the bourgeois occurs when everyone's class interest is roughly the same. It doesn't need to be exactly the same, but just roughly the same, that everyone is interested in increasing the wages of workers. This is why cooperatives are different to private firms, because everyone in a cooperative is simultaneously incentivized to work hard like a worker and also incentivized to increase productivity. Final question. Vita F says, is it possible to still have a system with private capital, but where no capital owner owns above that threshold? I think the answer is yes, but I'm not entirely sure. And it depends a lot about the size of the capital that we're talking about. I think that I can envision a market social system where you could even allow, let's say that you set some size of startup, like you're talking like less than 5 employees, new firm sort of things. It could be possible that these sorts of firms just aren't a big enough section of the economy that you're willing to let them go, or something along those lines. I do think, however, that you can't that when you're talking about bigger and bigger firms, it is increasingly clear they're above and above and above that threshold. If you're talking about a firm with a single owner, right, like an Elon Musk, who still directly owns and operates his firms, rather than what's his name, Bill Gates, who does not operate his firms. So summary. Paul Cockshott says market socialism creates inequality. I don't necessarily disagree. I think that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because inequality from productivity is good. Inequality from random chance or inequality due to inheritance is bad. They don't relate to productivity. I want to decrease inequality as much as possible, so long as we don't decrease productivity. Because 2, productivity is the ultimate determinant of the long-term growth of society, and I think that is like ultimately where the workers' interests and the entire society's interests reside. Interesting. Apparently Mondragon has a 1 to 9 lowest to highest earning threshold. That's really interesting, because the average firm in the United States has a 1 to 250 lowest to highest earning threshold. So this is the kind of example that I'm talking about. It's squishing the wage distribution, or what's called wage compression. Third point. Basically, my argument is that if we sufficiently compress the wages, then it is possible that everyone's class interests are aligned, and so the class struggle under capitalism is de facto abolished. Everyone is a worker, the proletariat has abolished itself, the bourgeois has been abolished, and so in this system, we are no longer under like capitalism in terms of interests. And so what Lenin is talking about capitalists picking up their interests and fighting for a new capitalism, I think that has been restrained now that everyone will be in the situation of a worker, is the argument. We'll see what else Paul Cockshott has to say. He's talking about labor migration. So let's let him talk. I think here.
Automatically work never existed, and that this emigration was taking place.
So context, since I did my big long rant, he's talking about the high unemployment in the Yugoslavian market social system leading people to leave Yugoslavia and move to another country. I think this represents a failure of the Yugoslavian market social system. We do see that there's lots and lots of social democracies that had substantially lower unemployment rates than Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had an unemployment rate of 20%. It was absurdly high. You can have a whole lot of systems that get closer and closer to like what I would call market socialism without having a 20% unemployment rate. Basically, the reasons behind the failure of Yugoslavian market socialism are complicated, and I will discuss them in a future video, but I don't think that these are inherent to market socialism. This is an example of a bad market socialism. The analogy would be that like there were huge failures of planning under Soviet centralized planning, but those failures do not necessarily prove that all central planning has those failures, if that makes any sense.
it reduced the level of visible unemployment in Yugoslavia. But the fact that this reserve army of labour existed and that this emigration was taking place indicates that the market socialist economy did not automatically work at a level which would ensure full employment.
And this was the second thing I was going to mention. Full employment is not per se a goal. The goal, to me, is reduction of poverty and promotion of innovation. Those are like the ultimate, the two big goals. And people who are unemployed but who are benefited by a large welfare state still fall under the poverty reduction. You don't need to work to be doing well in society, so long as a large welfare state pushes up the minimum income. That's the way that we can think about it. Again, it's about wage compression. You're pushing down the top income and you're pushing up the minimum income. So no matter what you do, even if you're not employed, you can stay with a minimum income. The argument for not having full employment is basically that to pursue full employment at all costs is often at odds with productivity. The way that most socialist firms, and in fact that firms in Yugoslavia did it, is what's called soft budget constraints, where the government would pay some firms more money to keep extra people on staff. This was not generally based on decisions of productivity. It was just based on the idea that they didn't want people to be unemployed. This is a really bad reason. This is equivalent to modern discussions of the jobs guarantee. Just wanting people to have a job because you want them to feel good is not a good argument. There are enormous efficiency arguments in favor of like universal basic income over a jobs guarantee, which I won't get too much into in this argument, but in short, giving people a job, even if that job isn't useful, is not a good idea.
Now, if you don't have the option of forcing the unemployed to emigrate, the pressure to allow the employment of workers from the bankrupt co-ops by other co-ops under what would amount to wage labour is going to be huge. Even if it's not going to be overt wage labour, it could be something like labour-only subcontracting. The effect would be the same. Some co-ops which had lots of cash would end up effectively employing the workers from the co-ops with no cash. And once wage labour is introduced, then the differentiation of income becomes much more extreme. Up until now, the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution just deals with the differentiation of income due to random statistical fluctuations.
Again, this is why I keep critiquing the model. The model does not include productivity. We have to imagine that there are random processes, and those will cause some firms that are high productivity to fail and some firms that are low productivity to fail. But in general, more productive firms will tend to do better than less productive firms. One of the interesting mechanisms in that concrete paper, which the concrete paper was the one which showed that the most productive concrete firms are about 2 times more productive than the least concrete firm, right? So 2-to-1 ratio, is that consistently the way the market operated was basically to take the 10% least productive concrete firms and push them out of business. So what we're talking about here, when we're talking about workers from bankrupt businesses having to be employed by workers from non-bankrupt businesses, is that we're talking about a shift of workers from less productive to more productive firms. Hey, Erasmus Rotterdamers, just came from Destiny video, gave me a great impression. Happy to hear it. Urbane Density has a quote which is funny, but I'm not sure how relevant. All that remains is that by continuously turning a crank, the king shall do all the work of England. I don't know what that means, but turn that crank, king. This is actually one of the interesting arguments that comes from minimum wage and collective bargaining sort of arguments. One of the things that we know with minimum wages is that when you raise the minimum wage, workers move from less productive firms to high productivity firms. We also know that under collectivized bargaining, where you set wages equal in a given field, workers again move from less productive to higher productivity firms. These are probably good consequences, so long as productive firms are being encouraged and they're expanding, right? They're getting more workers, they're expanding, they're re-employing these people. They aren't just like permanently disemployed. This is a good thing. More productive firms are a good thing. It increases long-run growth. It benefits everyone ultimately to have cheaper products and better production processes. You put less goods in, you have less environmental destruction, and you get the same amount of goods out. All right, back to the video.
Once wage labour is involved, you get a new mechanism. And both Yakovenko and Ian Wright, with whom I was one of the co-authors of Classical Econophysics, show that when this happens, you get the formation of a class of super-rich. Just the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution will never end up with anyone as rich as Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. But once you allow the exploitation of labour power, you get a new distribution for the super rich. You get a distribution which is a power law distribution rather than a negative exponential distribution, which allows people to become much richer. And then
So what I believe Paul Cockshott is trying to refer to here is that ultimately people get enough capital to then use those capital gains to exploit other people's wage labor. I think that the fundamental solution to this is limiting the amount of wealth that people can have, either by one, indirectly, an indirect method to limit their wealth is by limiting income, right? We've compressed income. Two, you can set direct limits on wealth. Three, you can tax wealth, which is actually a good thing for productivity reasons again. If you tax wealth, it encourages, for complicated reasons, it shifts wealth to people who have better investment than worse investment. People who are better investing are probably good at picking out productive firms. People who pick out productive firms probably help those productive firms expand. Again, this is a good thing. But you can limit all of that. And you can socialize some of that too. One of the big socialist programs that I think is a very interesting point is the social wealth fund. You don't necessarily need individuals to be doing a lot of this investing. You can give it to the state. The state can be an investor. And when the state has these large wealth investments that it tries to invest in productive firms, it is engaging in that productivity increasing behavior. But the benefits of these enormous, like the gains, the capital gains from this enormous wealth, from like the social wealth fund in Norway, for example, which is just truly enormous. Relative to the size of the Norwegian economy. The gains from the social wealth fund are then given back to the welfare state. They're given back to these like wage compression programs. So you've compressed wages from the top, and now you're using these investments to compress wages up from the bottom. You're making sure that the poor are limited on how poor they can be, both to ensure equality of opportunity and also to ensure a basic standard of life. I think what Paul Cockshott is saying is true of capitalism, but it doesn't need not be true of market socialism. That's the take. Tom is strong too. Destiny has a lot of things to say about you. Not disappointed. Can't wrap my head around socialism. I'm socked in by default. Hope to be enlightened. Maybe you can take the red pill. Urbane density, just getting at the undesirability of work, automation good. Yes. Innovation is the key driver ultimately of automation, and automation ultimately is the only way to like move towards like a fully automated communism sort of situation. One bad apple, I'm pretty sure this is like a copy paste that you're posting, right? Unalpha says, why stop at 15? Why not 100? Make everyone rich? Because after a certain point, a minimum wage would cause significant disemployment effects, but $12 to $15 probably won't cause significant disemployment effects from most of the evidence that I've seen. All right.
And essentially you have a capitalist economy. Socialism's back on the rocks. However, and we're now on number 26. Market socialism is feasible as a transitional measure.
So just a reminder, way back in the beginning of the video, he outlined the 5 points that he was going to raise. I said that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with market socialism's role in the first point. That's what happened. I would disagree very strongly on the wealth distribution point. That's the compression argument. I would disagree pretty strongly on the unemployment effect, and I disagreed on the importance of the unemployment effect because, again, I think that the wealth distribution and the unemployment thing, where they are productivity raising, are good, and where they are random or where they cause material harm to people are bad. I don't think it's that hard to raise those arguments. So now we're on to the limited positive role, says Cockshott, where one, they could be good for consumer goods markets. I think he's going to do that last, I guess. And again, that it's good as a transitional measure. And I agree with both of these points. And I will just be emphasizing them as he goes on.
In fact, in some sense, it's almost unavoidable as a transitional measure. Before you have a comprehensive planning system, before that has been established, some form of markets are going to be inevitable. The question is, what form of markets should a communist government aim for? In my view, you should aim for the transfer of all private enterprises into worker co-ops immediately. A transfer to a Yugoslav type economy straight away, before you have the ability to plan everything. Because the first task is to put all the surplus under the control of the working class. Even if it's in the hands of small groups of workers, it takes it out of the hands of the bourgeoisie. So,
to agree with Paul Cockshott, I really like this phrase from Michael Brooks, which is that the goal of socialism should in part be to take the pieces off the chessboard of like the class warfare. One of the strong resources that the bourgeois has is they've got a whole lot of money. When you take away their sources of money, either via taxation or by nationalization or by worker cooperatives, and you distribute that money more evenly and you give it increasingly to the hands of the workers, that money is both taken away from their side and given to our side, which enables us to do more with our resources. Totally agree.
Market co-ops are a market socialism in the form of mass cooperatives is an immediate measure that can be taken and is a progressive measure in the context of an already existing capitalist economy. But to prevent the atomization and competition and random differentiation of income that I described earlier, you immediately have to try and bring all the co-ops together into some super co-op level structure. I think there's a lot to be said for the De Leonis program in this sense, that the first step after establishing the co-ops is to establish syndicates based perhaps on the existing trade unions. So you'd have a dairy worker syndicate which managed all the factories producing yogurt, cheese, etc. An automobile worker syndicate which managed all the car factories which had previously been owned by a variety of different private companies, etc. Transport worker syndicate that would unify the land transport by road and by rail to prevent the competition between them.
So my fear here, so I do agree that it is important to bring all of these cooperatives together. However, I disagree on the method. I think that syndicates doing planning is highly problematic because syndicates have incentives that are sometimes at odds with society, and because they are very large organizations, they could sometimes oppose like the same way that the bourgeois can oppose like the general society trying to make them do certain behavior. Syndicates can also oppose that behavior. So that's like the political argument. The efficiency argument is even simpler. Is that sometimes that which benefits the syndicate is not that which benefits society, and so the argument is that a combination of competition and state planning can ensure that markets are efficient. However, planning inside of a syndicate system does not necessarily achieve those goals. Those are basically my arguments there. I don't have like extremely strong ideas of like syndicates, except where they have the purpose of basically keeping failing businesses alive. Again, it's the productivity argument. If there are cooperatives that are de facto subsidized by the syndicates so they don't go out of business, probably that hurts productivity, and probably in the long term that hurts everyone. Basically, syndicates might be good so long as they allow competition and they allow like society at large, democratic planning at large, to ensure that in a given sector, incentives are aligned such that they benefit society as a whole. All right. Let him lead on.
Once you've got that, you're in a position in parallel with this to introduce social planning, have calculation in kind for these syndicates, and once you have that going, then you can abolish money. You can't do it so long as the actual supply of goods to the individual syndicates depends on them being able to purchase from other syndicates. Let's assume that's been done. What do you have left? Well, what you have left is just a sort of pseudo-market under communism. In the first stage of communism.
What he's describing here is going to be akin to the Lange-Lerner model, which I can post a link about in chat in a moment. The Lange-Lerner model was a neoclassical model for socialism, which would have markets for consumer goods, and everything else would be planned. I'll let him lead on.
Marx describes as the continued existence of bourgeois right. It's not based on money at this stage. It's based on labour credits, and it only works in the consumer goods sector. I'm on slide 30. As I say, it's restricted to consumption goods. Doesn't apply to means of production because these are allocated between the syndicates by plan, between the freely associated producers, as Marx puts it. And there are no private sales. Sales of consumer goods occur only through the cooperative shops or through the state shops, so that private business is eliminated in part because as Marx says, the labour credits are no more money than a theatre ticket. They're cancelled out as soon as they're given up at a state factory or state warehouse. So that is, I don't know how long I've been talking. That's the end of my planned talk at 40 minutes. That's longer than I expected. So I'm ready for questions now.
So, again, the arguments here that I raise is that fundamentally the reason that I shifted from something akin to a Lange-Lerner model, which is very close to like a high degree of planning, you have a market and consumer goods, and then everything before that is planned, to more of just an open market socialist model, is because I have been convinced of the power of competition. I have been convinced that firms competing with each other increases innovation, and that it increases productivity, and it decreases prices. Ultimately, all of those things ensure that sectors are being as efficient as they can with the resources that they can be, and ultimately, again, innovation is the long-term driver of that sector growth in the long run. So that is like the most important thing to maximize of all the things that we've mentioned. So the take that I have when we're talking about having no private sales, this seems very likely to reduce competition and in turn to reduce innovation. It's possible that Cockshott can say, well, maybe planning has reductions on innovation via competition, but we make up for it by really overfunding R&D. The problem with this then is that you're talking about redistributing resources from productive firms to like R&D instead of simply having the firms being productive and then also distributing to that R&D. Why is it not possible to simply have efficient, productive firms and also take that additional money and give it to the R&D if this R&D is so useful? Fundamentally, I don't think that any of the arguments for a more planned system hold together unless we have evidence that competition does not deliver more innovation than planning, or that planning through some mechanism can deliver enormously more innovation than competition can. Let's see. One Bad Apple says, how do you know it's a copy pasta? Because you've sent it to me before. Truth in anime. Do you think this compression should be used to compress wages of hugely productive individuals like Hollywood actors? I can't tell if this is a meme. Urbane Density says Hollywood actors aren't highly productive, they're highly desired. Yes, that's precisely the point. Their value is a function of their size of their audiences. And one of the things that I actually argue for is that I want to see a compression of fame as well. You haven't sent it, but other people have sent that copy pasta. I want to see a compression of like fame as well. I want few people to have like enormously more fame than other people. I think that having these enormous differentials of fame leads to like celebrity culture and leads to people just believing things because someone is popular rather than believing things because like they're true. And so I think that part of the reason that Hollywood people are so insanely overvalued in my mind is because there's very few of them. It's a very competitive, underfunded industry. Lots of people want to have that job. So on the demand side for labor, it's like very, very desired. And then two, highly famous people are really, really useful for selling products in terms of advertisements. And I think that some of that will go away as like you have a system where advertisement is more based on like, I would argue that some of the socialist reforms that we're talking about should be reducing the role of like basically psychological manipulation in advertisement and moving towards more of a rating form based of advertisement, which is complicated and we can get into it. But in short, I think that people using psychological tricks to make you think that a product is good because a Hollywood actress liked it is bad. We should probably cut down on that. Yes, Shiny Baboon says abolish famous people. Okay, defund famous people. Okay. Whew. I know that was a long one. I know that not all of you stuck through with that. One Bad Apple says, how does market socialism address the crises of capitalism? Sure. So the basic answer is that we are already seeing even non-market socialism increasingly address the crises of capitalism. One of the things that we've noticed, and if you Google the term the Great Moderation, is that the crises have gotten fewer and fewer as countries have adopted more and more Keynesian economics. Basically, as countries have been more and more likely to spend money to do these sort of counter-cyclical policies where country enters a recession, you spend money to pump it back up, country leaves a recession, and you like reduce it down below. These reduce the cyclicality of capitalism's crises. They reduce the over and under production, and they increase long-term growth. And so the basic answer is a partial adoption of economic planning within a market context. It is subsidizing the market in the bad times and taxing the market in good times. But more so, because obviously the current market still has very, very large shifts. Sure. Thomas Strong says, how does the rating system not fall prey to the same psychological manipulations? The basic argument that I would like to see is that advertisement, unironically, I think that to some degree, ideal forms of advertisements are close to the way that Amazon does rating systems. What you'd want to do is have a system where new products, maybe on like, let's say that instead of Amazon, it's Govazon, okay? And so on Govazon, there is some degree to which new products and even old products are randomly shown to viewers. And those random products, then the consumer makes a decision whether or not to consume those. And then when they make a decision whether or not to consume those, they rate those products. And so ideally to me, the way that we should be wanting consumers to think about these things is using the ratings of their peers. And so the psychological biases that we're talking about here are the psychological biases like that are just inherent to liking or disliking a product. You can't escape that until you like change humans or something, right? Like, so long as humans are humans are just going to have certain biases about products. What you can change, you can take out the manipulation that is most modern advertisement works by you take a pretty lady, you stick her next to a car. I really want that car because I see the pretty lady next to it. It's based on association rather than objective ratings of a product. And so the goal, in short, is to make advertisement more objective by making it rely on user ratings more than on like manipulation. That's my basic answer. I have a even more complicated long answer if you want it, but that's the basic take. I don't know what that emoji you just sent is, but I will assume that it's true. True. So, summary. What I like about the video. I thought that Cockshott did a good argument. I would say that the strongest argument that they raised were in the transitional areas role, and that's just because I agree with them, right? Of course, I'm going to say that those arguments are good. I thought that those arguments were generally sound. I felt that the ideological one I thought was also true, that he did like a decent history there. However, I would argue that when he says that market socialism caused it, I would really say that what you're talking about is like failed market socialism and the general other causes that caused the collapse of the USSR were kind of conflated. And it's possible that the USSR and other systems could have done reforms in a more successful way. So a little bit weak there. The argument I most disliked were the effect on wealth distribution and unemployment. I felt that both of them basically failed to acknowledge that in addition to random distribution, there are productivity distributions under market systems. This is something that fucking Marx acknowledged. You don't need to be like a market socialist to acknowledge that competition generally selects for more productive firms. So if you don't acknowledge that, then you fail to acknowledge how some inequality can be justified. And if you don't acknowledge that, then any inequality looks like it's bad. And then therefore your argument, which is simply, hey, this system leads to inequality, is not a very good argument. You need to raise a specific argument that this system leads to inequality beyond that which is desirable. And I do not think that Cockshott rose to that level. In summary, I liked 2 and disliked 3 of the arguments that Cockshott presented. Thank you all. I have been streaming for 4 hours now, and I'm probably going to get off in just a moment. Like, get off streaming, not, you know. Yuri, the Soviet one, asks, is market socialism better than socialism? By which I presume you mean like central planning, just because of the competition. That's the main one, is competition. And I also raise a political argument. So competition is useful because it leads to innovation, is the argument that I raise. 2, the argument is that there's a political benefit of markets. So when you do central planning, you're giving an enormous amount of power to the central planners. The fear is that the central planners might use that power to basically like abuse people at the bottom or something. There is a benefit of having institutions outside of the state that have an ability to resist the state. So that's like the political argument. Those are the 2 main arguments for market socialism. The much, much, much stronger one, the one I focus on, is the economic argument. But there is like a side benefit, a political benefit of distribution of power to more than just one centralized state institution.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
And let's see. Superkel, what is your opinion on people who are very certain of, don't want to let go of their definition or extreme definition of socialism? I think that arguing that something is or isn't socialism just isn't very productive. My argument is consistently, I try to get people in this situation where I ask them, what does it matter if you call it socialism or not? What matters is whether it benefits people. Like, what is the fundamental moral impulse that you're driving towards? Is it like helping people's lives? And some of them will do like the standard Marxist answer, like, oh, I don't have morals, right? This is like a totally amoral theory. I'm simply describing how history will unfold. But that's just not true. The reason people support socialism, the reason people support communism, is because they have strong moral opinions about how society should be structured and how society, when structured, would operate. So the argument should not just be that this model is socialism because Marx said it or something. It should be that this model is socialism because it ensures that like the bourgeois are gone, and because it's and I also prefer this model because it's highly desirable for like human outcomes. That's my answer. Basically, the answer is don't care too much about definitions. Focus on the moral values. Tommy Strong apparently says, so abolish advertising and make your chance to encounter the product more random, but then the highly rated ones rise to the top. That's basically my argument. I would also say that there's some role for advertisement, but The basic argument is that limit the role of advertisements which aren't based on objective features. That's the way that I think about it. And final question I'll do.
Wake up, liberal.
Urbane density.
I love
Do you also justify markets because of their role in revealing preferences and information? Oh yeah, no. The main reason I don't bring that up is I think that relative to Paul Cockshott in particular's model, markets do also have an additional benefit because they reveal people's preferences and they give that information to firms. Because hey, 100 people bought this product at this price and they didn't buy this product at that price, right? That is like revealed information through people's behavior. Totally useful, relevant to Cockshott's argument where that is not the case. The problem is, the problem is that is not the case in certain models. So, for example, the Lange-Lerner model includes, like I was saying, a market in the consumer sector. And in the consumer sector, those preferences would be revealed, and then you just plan backwards relative to that. And so there's some models of socialism that escape this critique. Not some models of socialism, some models of central planning that escape this critique. So I just don't raise that because I think that, to be clear, I used to be a big fan of like the Lange-Lerner model. So I don't raise it because I know that I have a good response to it. Were I a planner to like oppose this, I would just say, oh, revealed information is great, but didn't you know that central planning can do that too?
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Thanks to the follow, Anarcho-Bourgeois. What a name. All right. I'm tired. I am gonna take y'all and put y'all to someone else.